The day Rebecca Bristol turned 32, the women of Dustcreek, Texas stopped inviting her to the quilting circles, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of something that felt worse, a quiet, collective resignation, as though her continued presence among the unmarried was an embarrassment they had all silently agreed to stop acknowledging. It was the spring of 1878, and Dustcreek sat in the flat, sun-bleached expanse of West Texas like a stubborn nail that refused to be pulled from old wood. The town had grown up around a single well and a trading post, and now it boasted a general store, a livery, a schoolhouse, a saloon called the Red Kettle, a church that had been rebuilt twice after lightning strikes, and about 200 souls who knew each other's business with the intimacy of people who had nothing else to fill their time. Rebecca Bristol ran the town's only telegraph office, which also doubled as a postal station, out of a narrow whitewashed building at the eastern edge of the main street. She had taken the position 6 years ago, after her father, the previous operator, died of a fever that swept through Dustcreek in the winter of 1872. She had learned the work at his elbow from the time she was 14, and by the time she was old enough to do it herself, she was already better at it than he had been, quicker with the key, sharper with the codes, capable of holding 3 incoming transmissions in her head while composing a 4th for outgoing. None of that impressed the women of Dustcreek. What they saw when they looked at Rebecca was a tall woman with dark auburn hair she kept pinned up under a practical felt hat, brown eyes that had a disconcerting habit of looking directly at whoever she was speaking to, and no husband. She had come close to being married once, to a man named Gerald Hutchins who had worked at the mill outside of town. Gerald had been decent enough, quiet, with big capable hands and a modest ambition to one day own a small farm. They had kept company for the better part of a year, and then one Saturday morning he had ridden out with 2 other men to look at land up near Abilene, and had come back 3 weeks later married to a woman he had met at a church social there. He had the grace, at least, to look thoroughly ashamed when he delivered this news. Rebecca had thanked him politely, gone home, sat down at her kitchen table, and stayed there for the better part of an afternoon before deciding that grief, while entirely reasonable under the circumstances, was not something she had the luxury of indulging at length. She had gone back to work the following Monday and had not, as far as anyone in Dustcreek could observe, pined visibly since. This was itself held against her by certain women in town, chiefly Mavis Turnbull, who ran the dry goods side of the general store, and who had appointed herself the unofficial arbiter of feminine propriety in Dustcreek. Mavis had the kind of rounded, rosy face that suggested warmth but the kind of eyes that suggested surveillance, and she had opinions about Rebecca Bristol, the way a dog has opinions about a fence post: constant, possessive, and entirely unwelcome. The trouble with Rebecca, Mavis had been known to say, lowering her voice just enough to suggest confidentiality while ensuring everyone in earshot could hear, is that she is too independent for her own good. A man wants to feel needed, and Rebecca makes it plain she needs nobody. It was not entirely untrue. Rebecca had built a life that functioned. She had her work, which she was good at. She had her small house, which she kept clean and comfortable. She had her garden out back, where she grew tomatoes and a few rows of corn that the deer got into every August without fail, a fact that infuriated her and also, secretly, gave her something to think about. She had her books, sent in from San Antonio twice a year, and her correspondence with her cousin Martha in Missouri, and her friendship with Doc Hargrove, who was 60 and gruff and whose company she found preferable to most people's because he talked about interesting things and never commented on her marital status. She was not unhappy. This was perhaps the most confounding thing about her, from the town's perspective. She did not appear to be suffering, and a woman of 32 who was unmarried and not suffering was something Dustcreek, Texas, simply did not have a comfortable category for. The spring of 1878 moved along in its slow, brutal way, the heat arriving earlier than usual, the creek running lower than it should have, and the ranchers out on the flats starting to talk about drought with the careful, sideways manner of men who are genuinely frightened but consider fear impolite. Rebecca received their messages at the telegraph station, encoded and transmitted their anxious inquiries to buyers in Fort Worth and bankers in San Antonio, and generally served as the town's nervous system without anyone much remarking on it. It was on a Wednesday morning in late April, a morning that smelled of dust and heat and the faint sweetness of the mesquite blooming along the creek bed, that the stage from El Paso came in 2 days late and deposited, among its cargo of mail sacks and 1 crate of patent medicine, a single passenger. Rebecca was in her office at the time, hunched over a particularly garbled transmission that had come in from the line station 20 miles west and appeared to be telling her something urgent about a cattle shipment that had gone wrong, though the signal was so broken she could only reconstruct about half the message. She was so absorbed in the work that she did not look up when the stage rolled past her window or when the sound of boots on the board sidewalk passed her door. She found out about the new arrival the way she found out about most things in Dustcreek through Mavis Turnbull, who appeared in the telegraph office doorway approximately 40 minutes after the stage had come in, wearing her best blue shirtwaist and an expression of carefully controlled excitement. "There is a man," Mavis said, without preamble, stepping inside without being invited. "There frequently are," Rebecca said, without looking up from her transcription notes. "A new man, off the El Paso stage. He has taken a room at Harding's boarding house, and he told Mr. Harding he is here to look at property." Mavis paused for effect. "He is single. And he is quite," she searched for the right word, "well presented." "Good for him," Rebecca said. "Rebecca," Mavis's voice took on the tone she used when she was about to say something she believed to be for someone else's benefit. "You are 32 years old. I am aware of my age, Mavis. I am only saying, I know what you are only saying." Rebecca finally looked up, meeting Mavis's eyes with the direct, unflinching gaze that so many people in Dustcreek found unsettling. "Is there something you need sent by telegraph? Or are you here to remind me of information I already possess?" Mavis left in a huff, which was more or less how most of Rebecca's conversations with Mavis ended, and Rebecca went back to her broken transmission and did not think about the new arrival again until that afternoon. Perry Conroy was 35 years old, which she would learn later, and he had arrived in Dustcreek not quite by accident but not quite by design either. He had come from a ranch outside of Laredo, where he had spent the last 4 years working as foreman for an outfit called the Callaway Operation, and before that from a failed attempt to establish his own small cattle concern in New Mexico that had ended badly not through incompetence, but through the particular cruelty of a drought that had lasted 3 years and killed everything he had built. Before New Mexico, there had been a wife, briefly, a woman named Clara who had died of cholera in 1872, less than a year after they were married, a fact that Perry had folded away inside himself the way you fold a letter you cannot bear to throw away but cannot bear to read, deep, hidden, felt only at unexpected moments. He was not a man who talked much about himself, which was partly temperament and partly the habit of someone who had learned that his history, laid out plainly, tended to make people uncomfortable or pitying, and he had no use for either response. He had come to Dustcreek because a man he trusted, a rancher named Abbott who ran cattle up near the Concho River, had written him to say there was a good parcel of land for sale out on the flats east of town, good grazing land that had been let go at a fair price because the owner had died without heirs, and the bank in San Antonio was tired of holding the note. Perry had the money for it, saved carefully over 4 years of foreman's wages, and the very modest amount he had salvaged from the wreck of his New Mexico enterprise. It was not enough for a grand beginning, but it was enough for a real one, and he had spent enough years working other men's land to know with absolute certainty that he wanted his own. He had not planned to stay in Dustcreek longer than it took to close the land deal and make initial arrangements. He had planned to ride out to the property, assess what needed doing, determine what supplies he would need, conduct the relevant business with the bank's local representative, and be on his way toward establishing his new life with the efficiency of a man who has been waiting a long time and is not inclined to dawdle. He had not planned on the telegraph office. He had not planned on Rebecca Bristol. He needed to send a wire to San Antonio to notify the bank representative there of his arrival and his intention to proceed with the land purchase. He had been told the telegraph office was at the east end of the main street, and so, on his first afternoon in Dustcreek, having settled his gear at the boarding house, he walked the length of the main street in the late afternoon heat with his hat pulled low against the sun, and his eyes moving with the automatic habit of a man who had spent years in places where paying attention was a practical necessity. He was, as Mavis had noted, well presented. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a lean build that suggested a life spent in physical work rather than a desire for any particular impression. His face was weathered in the way that faces get weathered in West Texas, the lines at the corners of his eyes deep and permanent. His jaw clean-shaven, though his hair was a little long, dark brown going gray at the temples in a way that he was entirely unaware of, and that several women in Dustcreek would note within the first 24 hours of his arrival. He wore good-working clothes, not fancy, but quality, and he moved with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. The door of the telegraph office was open to catch what little breeze existed in the late afternoon heat. He stepped inside, removing his hat automatically, and found himself in a narrow room that smelled of paper and ink and something faintly floral that he could not immediately identify. There was a counter running the length of the room, and behind it, bent over a set of papers with her brow furrowed and a pencil moving rapidly, was the most obviously competent-looking woman he had seen in a long time. He waited. She did not look up. He cleared his throat. "One moment," she said, without any change in her focus, her pencil still moving. He waited another 30 seconds. Then she finished what she was doing, set down the pencil and looked up. He met the direct brown gaze that had so unsettled Mavis Turnbull and the rest of Dustcreek, and felt something entirely different. He felt with a clarity that surprised him that here was a person who was actually present, actually seeing him, not the version of him people usually saw the stranger, the unknown quantity, the potential, but him, just a man standing in a telegraph office with his hat in his hands. "What can I do for you?" Rebecca said. Her voice was even, businesslike, pleasant without being performative about it. "I need to send a wire to San Antonio," he said, "to a Mr. Ashford at the Cattlemen's Bank there. I have the address." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. She took it, unfolded it, glanced at the address, and nodded. "And the message? Tell him Perry Conroy has arrived in Dustcreek and is prepared to proceed with the Bristol land purchase at the terms previously agreed upon." Something shifted very slightly in her expression. "Bristol," she said. "That's what the property is called," he said. "Named for the original holder, I was told. A man named Thomas Bristol," she said quietly. "My uncle." A beat of silence. "Your uncle," Perry repeated. "My father's brother. He died in 1875. He had no children and his wife had died before him. He left the land but no one to work it, and the bank took the note." She said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has already finished grieving and has arrived at the simpler place beyond it, but something in her eyes suggested the simplicity was deliberate. "So you are the one who is buying the Bristol parcel?" "I am," he said, watching her carefully, not sure if this information would change something, not sure what he would do if it did. She seemed to consider for a moment, and then she reached for a fresh message form. "What would you like to tell Mr. Ashford?" he told her. She wrote it down, her handwriting quick and clear, and read it back to him to confirm. He confirmed. She named him the cost of the transmission. He paid it, and she turned to the telegraph key on the small table behind her and began working it with a speed and precision that he found himself watching with frank admiration. Not because it was beautiful to watch, though it was, but because it was competence in its most honest form, someone doing something they knew exactly how to do. "It will be sent immediately," she said, turning back. "If there is a reply today, I will have someone bring it to you at the boarding house. If not, I will have it first thing tomorrow." "Thank you," he said. He put his hat back on and then, instead of leaving, stayed where he was for a moment, which he recognized as unusual for himself. "I'm sorry about your uncle's land." She looked at him. "It has been 3 years," she said, "and it is a good parcel. It deserves someone who will work it properly." He held her gaze. "I intend to." "Then I hope it serves you well," she said, and the firmness of it was a kind of blessing, unexpected and sincere. And he carried it out of the office with him and back up the main street in the dying heat of the afternoon, turning it over in his mind the way you turn over something you are not sure what to do with but are quite sure you want to keep. The next morning Perry Conroy rode out to the Bristol parcel with the land agent, a nervous young man named Clem who sweated continuously and talked too much, and spent several hours walking the property. It was, as Abbott had told him, a good piece of land. The grazing was honest and the grass, despite the general dryness of the spring, was showing better than the flats closer to town. There was a creek line, a genuine one, not just a seasonal drainage running along the northern edge that would be adequate for cattle if properly managed. The original buildings were in disrepair but structurally sound. The house in particular, a solid two-room structure of cut limestone with a covered porch on the east side, needed work but not replacement. The barn was more pressing. The roof on one end had gone through, and there was significant work to be done before it could hold animals through a Texas summer storm. Perry walked the perimeter in the long morning light and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific satisfaction of believing in something. Not the blind, young man's certainty he had brought to his New Mexico venture, but something quieter and more durable, a recognition that this land and this moment were something he could make real. He signed the papers that afternoon in the bank representative's office, a small space above the general store that smelled of mildew and old tobacco, and walked out into the spring afternoon, the legal owner of 340 acres in Dustcreek, Texas, and the small stone house and falling-down barn that came with it. He went directly to the telegraph office to send word to Abbott, who had made the introduction that had led him here, and deserved to know the deal was done. Rebecca was at her counter. She looked up when he came in, and something in her expression, very slight, moved. "Good news," she said. "It's done," he said, and the quiet satisfaction in his voice was entirely unguarded. "Good," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. She reached for a message form. "For Mr. Abbott, you remember," he said, mildly surprised. "I am in the business of remembering things precisely," she said. "It is required for the work." "I'd imagine so." He watched her write the header of the form. "Miss Bristol, Mrs." She paused, then corrected herself without embarrassment. "Miss, I apologize. I have been called Miss so long I sometimes reverse them. Miss Rebecca Bristol." "Miss Bristol," he said, beginning again, "would you consider joining me for supper?" "Not tonight if that is inconvenient. Any evening. There is no particular reason for the invitation except that I am new to Dustcreek and do not know anyone, and you have been kind, and He stopped, recognizing that the sentence had gotten away from him somewhat, and tried to rein it back. "I would simply appreciate the company." Rebecca looked at him for a moment with those direct brown eyes. In another life, in a life where Mavis Turnbull had not spent 6 years grinding down whatever impulse toward hope Rebecca had retained after Gerald Hutchins, she might have accepted immediately. But the grinding had had its effect, not in making her miserable, but in making her cautious in a way that had become indistinguishable from practicality. "I eat at the Silver Fork on Thursday evenings," she said finally. "It is the better of the two places on the main street, and Thursdays are when Mrs. Garcia makes her chicken and rice, which is worth attending for. If you happen to be there this Thursday, I would not be opposed to company. It was not, strictly speaking, an acceptance. It was something more interesting than an acceptance. It was an opening, careful and particular, the kind that comes from someone who has been enough times disappointed to have learned the precise amount of hope that is safe to extend. Thursday, he said, I will be there. He was there. He arrived at the Silver Fork at 6 o'clock, which was when the evening crowd generally arrived, and found Rebecca already seated at a corner table with a glass of water and a copy of a 2-week-old newspaper from San Antonio, which she set down without self-consciousness when he came in. You found it, she said. It's the only street in town, he said, pulling out the chair across from her. The finding was not difficult. The corner of her mouth turned up. It was, he would come to recognize, her version of laughing, a dry, contained amusement that she allowed to surface only in small amounts, as though she had learned not to give too much away at once. They ate Mrs. Garcia's chicken and rice, which was indeed excellent, and they talked with the careful, probing quality of two people who are genuinely curious about each other and also aware that they know very little. She asked him about the land, and he told her about it honestly, including the state of the barn roof and his plans for the summer's work. She listened with the focused attention she brought to everything and asked questions that were specific and practical, the kind of questions you ask when you actually understand the subject, not the kind you ask to seem interested. You know something about cattle ranching, he said, somewhere in the middle of it. My uncle ran cattle on that land for 20 years, she said. I used to spend summers there as a child. My father and Thomas were close when they were speaking. A small pause. They had falling outs. Brothers do. What kind of falling out? The usual kind, she said. One man had more than the other and was not careful about how he showed it, and the other was proud and would not ask for help when the operation got difficult. My father had the telegraph business and my uncle had the land, and they each believed they had chosen correctly, and they managed to disagree about it bitterly for the last 8 years of their lives and were never fully reconciled. She said it plainly, without drama. I wrote to Thomas every month regardless. He wrote back. It was not the same as what they should have had, but it was something. Perry was quiet for a moment. I had a brother like that, he said. Different situation. But the same basic architecture of stubbornness. He lives, Perry said. We do not speak. He is in Missouri. I do not know him well anymore. He turned his water glass in his hands. Some distances are not entirely geography. No, she agreed. They are not. They sat with that understanding for a moment, and it had the comfortable quality of an understanding that does not need elaboration, the kind that settles between two people who have both learned the same hard thing by different routes. He walked her home after supper, the evening air finally beginning to drop towards something approaching tolerable, the sky over the flat Texas landscape enormous and deep blue, going to purple at the edges where the sun had gone down. Thank you for the company, he said at her gate, which was a low white-painted wooden affair that led to the path up to her front door. Thank you for asking for it, she said. She rested her hand on the gate post. How long will you be in town before you go out to the property? I had thought to start work on the barn next week, he said. I will be riding back and forth for a while until there is enough to sleep out there. The nights are still cold, she said. You will want a proper fire. The fireplace in the stone house draws well. Thomas kept it maintained. You know the house, he said. I know every room of it, she said. There was something in her voice that was not quite sadness but was the thing that lives adjacent to sadness, a tenderness for something lost. I hope you make it a good home. I intend to, he said, and then, because he was a man who had learned to be direct about the things that mattered, he said, I would very much like to do this again, Miss Bristol. Supper, or a walk, or whatever is agreeable. I am not in the habit of making social overtures that I don't mean. She looked at him in the evening light. The town was quiet around them, the sounds of the saloon, a faint thrum from the other end of the street, a dog barking somewhere distant, the smell of dust and night-blooming things mixing. No, she said, I don't think you are. She opened the gate. Saturday morning I generally walk out along the creek. It is cooler in the morning if you are not otherwise engaged. I will not be otherwise engaged, he said. The creek walk on Saturday was the beginning of something that Dustcreek noticed before either of them had fully articulated it to themselves. They walked for an hour along the cottonwood-lined bank of the creek, where the water was low but running, and the morning air was still cool enough to be pleasant, the light young and pale gold across the flat land. They talked about everything with a naturalness that surprised both of them. His time in New Mexico, which he found himself describing in more detail than he had shared with anyone in years, the 3 years of drought and the slow, terrible arithmetic of it, the night he had made the decision to sell what remained and leave. She listened without offering false comfort, which was one of the things he was beginning to understand about her. She did not smooth things over. She let them be what they were. She told him about her father's illness, the 2 years it had taken him, the way she had slowly absorbed more and more of the telegraph work until she was doing most of it herself before he died, so that by the time she was formally the operator it was not a change but a continuation. She told him about the way the town had settled into treating her, not unkindly, for the most part, but as a category rather than a person, and she said it with the detached observation of someone examining something interesting rather than the bitterness of someone still wounded by it. "Does it not bother you," he asked, "being seen as something lesser than what you are?" "It did when I was younger," she said. They were sitting on a flat limestone rock at a bend in the creek, watching the water move over the pale stones. "I used to argue with it, or try to prove it wrong, which are both exhausting strategies and ultimately useless because you cannot change the view of someone who has decided not to see you accurately." She picked up a small, flat stone and turned it in her fingers. "Now I mostly find it irrelevant. Mavis Turnbull's opinion of my marital status has no bearing on whether the telegraph works or whether I do my job well or whether my tomatoes come up properly. Yet," he said carefully, "I imagine there are moments when it is not entirely irrelevant." She was quiet for a moment. "There are moments," she allowed, "when it is 3 in the morning and there has been a long week and the house is very quiet." She threw the stone into the water. "But that is loneliness, which is a different thing from whether Mavis Turnbull is right about anything." "Yes," he said. He knew the 3 in the morning silence she was describing with an intimacy that did not require explanation. "Yes, it is." He met her eyes. There was something unguarded in both their faces in that moment, a mutual recognition of the specific texture of being alone that has moved past self-pity into something harder and quieter and more real. He did not say anything to fix it, and she did not want him to, and the silence between them had a warmth to it that was different from the sun on the limestone. On the way back along the creek she caught her boot on an exposed root and stumbled, and his hand came out automatically and caught her arm, and she steadied herself and looked up at him with a slight breath of surprised laughter, and for just a moment, with the creek sound and the cottonwood leaves overhead and her arm solid in his hand, something shifted between them that could not be shifted back. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was slightly different from usual, softer at the edges. "Any time," he said. He released her arm, but slowly. Dustcreek noticed all of this because in a town of 200 people, with nothing of particular interest happening that spring, 2 people walking along the creek on a Saturday morning was approximately as conspicuous as a fireworks display. By Sunday morning after church, which both Rebecca and Perry attended separately at the small white church, every person in Dustcreek knew they had been seen together twice. Mavis Turnbull held court on the church steps in her Sunday hat and said, within earshot of Rebecca's friend and neighbor, a quiet woman named Dorothea Ingle, that it was terribly sad, really, because whatever the man's intentions, a woman of Rebecca's age could not reasonably hope for anything serious to come of it, and it would only end in embarrassment. Dorothea, who had a gentle personality but was not a coward, reported this to Rebecca that afternoon with the apologetic manner of someone delivering necessary intelligence. Rebecca received it in the way she received most unpleasant information, straightening slightly, pressing her lips together briefly, and then returning to whatever she had been doing before. "Mavis," she said with a tone of tired finality, "will say what Mavis says. I have been her subject since I was 26, and I expect to remain her subject regardless of what I do or do not do." She paused. "The interesting question is whether she is right." "About Mr. Conroy?" Dorothea asked. "About the embarrassment," Rebecca said. "It seems to me that the only genuinely embarrassing thing would be allowing what other people expect of me to govern what I actually do." Dorothea, who had known Rebecca for 8 years and loved her without reservation, felt something release in her chest that she had not known she was holding. "He is very decent looking," she said carefully. "He is," Rebecca said, with the slight turn at the corner of her mouth that was her laugh. "He is also intelligent and direct, and not at all put off by a woman who can think for herself, which is rarer than it ought to be." She smoothed the apron she had just put on, looking out her kitchen window at the back garden. "I am being careful, Dorothea." "I know you are," Dorothea said. "I am only saying that careful does not have to mean closed." "No," Rebecca said quietly, "it does not." The following week, Perry Conroy began work on the Bristol parcel in earnest. He had hired 2 men from town for the summer, brothers named Walt and Hector Fuentes, who were known to be good workers, and the 3 of them spent the first week on the barn roof, which needed new beams and new planking on the failed end, and a full replacement of the weathered shingles. The work was hot and demanding, and Perry threw himself into it with the concentrated energy of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to direct himself toward. He came into town on Wednesday of that week for supplies from the general store and stopped at the telegraph office afterward. There was no practical reason for the stop. He had no messages to send. He stopped anyway. Rebecca was at her counter. She looked up with the expression of someone who is not entirely surprised. "No wire to send today," he said, standing in the doorway. "No," she agreed. "I suspected not." "I was passing," he said. Then, because she was looking at him with that clear-eyed, amused attention, he added, "I was not passing. I walked out of my way." The turn at her mouth was more pronounced this time. "I know," she said. "The general store is at the other end of the street." "It is," he said. "May I come in?" "You are already in," she pointed out. He had, in fact, already stepped inside the doorway. She gestured to the chair on the public side of the counter that was there for people waiting for transmissions. "Sit down. I have a message incoming from Midland that requires my attention for the next few minutes, but after that I am free." He sat down and watched her work, which was still, even for the 3rd time, remarkable to watch. The speed at which her hand moved on the key, the way she listened to the return signal with her eyes slightly unfocused, translating the rhythms into language with a skill that looked effortless because it was, by now, completely natural. She wrote down the message, sent a confirmation, and then turned back to him. They talked for an hour in the small, warm office, the afternoon light moving across the floor, the occasional horse passing on the street outside. They talked about the barn work and about the state of the pasture and about the history of the land, and she told him things about his own property that he had not known, where the best morning shade was, where the ground was soft after rain and would need to be avoided with heavy cattle, the way the wind came through the western draw on summer evenings and could cool the house if you opened the right windows. "You love that land," he said. She considered it. "I have a feeling for it," she said. "It is where I was happy as a child. It is also not mine, and I made my peace with that." She met his eyes. "I am glad it is yours." He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that regardless of your answer, it will not change the way I intend to conduct myself toward you, because what I think of you is not conditional on your answer." She tilted her head slightly. "All right." "What happened with Gerald Hutchins?" he said. "It is not my business. But the way people in town handle you, the way they expect you to be either eager or resigned, I find myself wanting to understand who they are talking about versus who I am actually talking to. And I think those are 2 very different people." The quiet between them had a quality of held breath. "Gerald was a good man," she said finally. "Not a bad man. Simply a man who decided that what was convenient was also what he wanted, and they happened not to be the same thing at the same time." She smoothed a piece of paper on her counter with the flat of her hand, a gesture that seemed automatic, something to do with her hands while she spoke. "It was not a great love. I think I knew that and chose not to know it at the same time, the way you do when you are 25 and the prospect of another year of being looked at the way Dustcreek looks at me is more discouraging than the prospect of a marriage that is merely adequate." A pause. What I mourned afterward was not Gerald, particularly. It was the idea that I had been willing to settle for adequate, and what that said about how I had come to think of myself. He did not offer comfort and did not dismiss what she had said. He sat with it in the respectful way of someone who takes what you have told them seriously. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "the woman I have been talking to for the past 2 weeks does not read to me as someone who has settled for anything." She met his eyes. Something in her, careful and long-held and deeply practiced, shifted. "Thank you," she said. It was not her polite, deflecting thank you. It was genuine and smaller and meant for him. The summer came down on Dustcreek with the full weight of a West Texas July, and everything slowed to the pace that the heat demanded. Work on the Bristol parcel continued regardless. Perry Conroy was not a man who let weather govern his schedule beyond the unavoidable limits of practicality. The barn was finished in June, a solid, rebuilt thing that he and the Fuentes brothers had reason to be proud of. July saw the start of work on the house itself, repairs and improvements, new windows on the south side, the chimney repointed, the porch refloored with new boards that smelled of raw pine. He came into town twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and he always stopped at the telegraph office, and after the first couple of weeks neither of them pretended the stop was incidental. He brought her things, sometimes a jar of the honey from the hive that had been established near the creek on the property, a pocketful of the wild plums that grew along the eastern fence line, small things that he had noticed and thought she might like, offered without ceremony and received in kind. She came out to the property twice in July, once with practical purpose. She had received a transmission regarding a water rights dispute that touched on the property's eastern boundary and wanted to show him the relevant documents in context. And once because he had asked her to come see the barn when it was done, and she had come, and had stood in the repaired structure looking up at the new rafters with an expression that was not easy to categorize. A mixture of grief and relief, and something forward-looking that he understood in its way, was a kind of letting go. On that second visit they had ridden back from the property together in the long summer evening, the horizon extraordinary in its colors, orange and rose, and the deep copper of West Texas sunsets at their most extravagant, and had talked easily the whole way. And at some point, their horses had drawn alongside each other on the flat trail, and his hand had come over and she had taken it briefly, her fingers wrapping around his. And they had ridden that way for a quarter mile without saying anything until the trail narrowed near the creek crossing, and they had to separate. Neither of them mentioned it. Both of them remembered it with the precision of something that mattered. In August, a man named Cord Denley arrived in Dustcreek. Cord Denley was the kind of man who arrived in small towns with a particular category of bad intention, dressed up as ordinary commerce. He was big, broad-faced, with the kind of physical presence that had probably served him well in situations that rewarded intimidation. And he had come, it emerged, to look into the water rights along the main creek line. Specifically, to look into whether there was a legal mechanism by which those rights could be consolidated, and the outlying landholders who depended on the creek could be pressured into selling at reduced prices. He was not the first man of his type to pass through this part of Texas in 1878. The cattle business was changing, consolidating, and men like Cord Denley served as advance agents for larger operations that wanted to gobble up the small holdings of the flat country. Perry became aware of Denley within 2 days of his arrival, through the ordinary channels of a small town, the boarding house dining table, the general conversation at the general store, the worried looks exchanged between the small ranchers and farmers who came into town on Saturdays. The water rights issue was real and serious. The creek that ran through the Bristol parcel and several neighboring properties was genuinely the lifeline of those operations, and any legal manipulation of those rights would be potentially ruinous. He also became aware that Denley had been asking questions about the telegraph office, specifically about whether the transmissions that passed through it were recorded and whether those records could be accessed. This was a question that had a troubling implication, because it suggested either that Denley was transmitting things he did not want on record, or that he was worried about someone else transmitting things that were on record that he did not want transmitted. Perry went to the telegraph office on a Tuesday morning and found Rebecca already aware of the situation. She had, as it turned out, already received 2 transmissions in the past week that she had found troubling inquiries about land title records and water allocation filings from a legal firm in Fort Worth that she recognized as having a particular reputation for facilitating exactly this kind of operation. "He came in yesterday," she said, keeping her voice low, though they were alone. "He wanted to know if I kept copies of all transmissions. What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, which is that I keep records as required by the regulations of the Telegraph Company and the United States Postal Service, and that those records are not available for private review." Her jaw was set. He was not pleased with that answer. "He said something to you?" Perry's voice changed quality. "He was not threatening," she said carefully. "He was simply very clear about his displeasure, and he is a man who uses his size in conversation the way some men use it in a fight as the first communication before the actual words." She met Perry's eyes. "I have encountered it before. I am not frightened of it." "I know you are not," Perry said. "That is not precisely what concerns me." She looked at him. In his expression was something she was not entirely used to seeing directed at her, not the aggressive protectiveness that she had always found condescending, the kind that suggested she could not manage herself, but something quieter and more specific. A man who was worried about her as a person because she mattered to him. It produced a warmth in her chest that she breathed through carefully. "What does concern you?" she asked. "If he is operating illegally or close enough to it that exposure matters to him, and he knows that the telegraph records could be part of an exposure, then you are in a position of holding information he does not want held." He paused. "I want to know that you are not alone in that position." "I have Doc Hargrove," she began. "Doc is 60 and a friend," Perry said. "That is not the same as having someone with a practical ability to act in a situation that requires it." A beat. "I am not saying you need a man. I am saying you should not be entirely alone in something that could become difficult." She considered him. "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing," he said, "that we figure out together what is happening, what the legal position is, and what the right action is. The water rights issue affects my property as much as it affects anyone else's out on the flats. I have a practical stake in it, and I would also like," he paused, choosing to not leave you managing it without backup. It was said simply and directly, without theater, and she received it the same way. "All right," she said. "Then let me show you what I have." What she had was considerable. 6 years of operating the telegraph office had given her an excellent sense of which transmissions were ordinary commerce and which had a different smell to them, and the recent communications around the water rights had the particular smell of legal maneuvering that was trying to stay just inside the edges of what was permitted. She had copies of everything relevant, organized in the methodical way she organized everything. They spent 2 hours that morning going through the documents together, and what emerged was a picture of a scheme that was not quite outright fraud, but was predicated on taking advantage of the imprecise and conflicting nature of the water allocation records, which had been made at different times by different entities, and did not entirely agree with one another. Denley's legal people in Fort Worth appeared to be planning to file a consolidated claim based on one set of records while ignoring another set that contradicted it. "The State Land Office in Austin has the earlier records," Rebecca said. "They would supersede the Fort Worth filing if they were submitted in response." "You get a copy of those records transmitted here." "I can," she said. "It will take 2 or 3 days. I would need to write to the Austin office formally," and she paused. "Denley will know a transmission came in. He has been watching who comes in and out of this office." "Then we need to be careful about what the transmission looks like from the outside," Perry said. He thought for a moment. "Send it as part of a larger routine request. I need to file my own property documents with the state office anyway. I had been planning to do it next month. We do it now, and the relevant water records come back as part of the standard package." She looked at him with something that was close to admiration, or perhaps was admiration and simply had not fully surfaced yet. "That would work," she said. "Good," he said. He leaned on the counter looking at her, and something in his face went from practical to something else. "You have been doing this kind of thing alone for 6 years," he said. "I have." "And nobody," he started again. "The other ranchers whose water rights are at stake, none of them thought to bring this to you. They talked to each other at the feed store and wondered about it, and none of them thought to come here, where the actual information is. They did not consider it," she said. There was no bitterness in it. "The telegraph office is a service they use. The woman who runs it is," she made a small gesture, "background." "Not to me," he said. The words were quiet and plain, and they reached her in the way that plain things reach you when you have been waiting a long time to hear them, not with the drama of revelation but with the simple, enormous relief of recognition. She took a breath. "Perry," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. "Rebecca," he said back, and the smile that crossed his face was not the polished, social kind but the real kind, the kind that gets into the eyes and stays there. She looked at her counter, then back at him. "There is a matter of some practical urgency to address first," she said, and her voice was steady, though something in her was considerably less so. "There is," he agreed, "and we will address it." And then he left it there because she had understood him already. He could see it. "And then," she said, "they filed the transmissions that afternoon. Within 2 days the response came back from the Austin Land Office, embedded in a standard package of property documentation, exactly as they had planned. The records it contained were unambiguous. The water allocation along the creek line had been established under a territorial grant that predated the county records by 12 years and superseded them entirely. Denley's Fort Worth lawyers did not know these records existed, or had gambled that no one in Dustcreek would know enough to find them. Perry rode out the following Saturday to call a meeting with the other landholders whose properties were touched by the creek. They met at the Fuentes family's place. 5 ranchers and 2 homesteaders gathered in the shade of a broad oak tree with sweat and worry on their faces, and Perry laid out what Rebecca had found with the clarity of a man who understood what he was presenting and why it mattered. He gave her full credit by name, which produced a moment of genuine surprise among several of the ranchers, followed by a sheepish recalibration as they processed the implication of having ignored a significant resource for years. The documents were filed with the county clerk the following week. Cord Denley, finding that his legal scheme had a significant problem in the form of prior records that contradicted his entire approach, left Dustcreek by the end of August with considerably less ceremony than he had arrived. The week after Denley left, Doc Hargrove said to Perry Conroy at the bar of the Red Kettle, where they had both ended up one evening by coincidence and had ordered the same thing and fallen into conversation, "I have known Rebecca Bristol for 8 years. She is the most genuinely capable person in this town and the most thoroughly undervalued one." Perry looked at his glass. "I know," he said. Doc Hargrove studied him with the diagnostic attention he brought to everything. "What are you waiting for?" he said. It was, as questions went, extremely precise. "I'm not entirely sure she is ready," Perry said. Doc Hargrove made a sound that managed to convey both patience and mild exasperation simultaneously. "Son," he said, "in my experience, people who have been as careful as Rebecca are always more ready than they appear to be from the outside. The caution is not absence of feeling. It is the thing that protects the feeling while it becomes real enough to trust." He took a drink of his whiskey. "She trusts you. I can see it from across the street, and I have 60-year-old eyes." Perry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the slight smile that had become familiar to Doc Hargrove over the summer, "Thank you, Doctor." He did not court Rebecca in the formal manner that the social customs of 1878 would have suggested, or in the manner that Mavis Turnbull would have approved of, which involved the man calling on the family head for permission, since Rebecca had no family head, and the woman receiving attention in the presence of a chaperone, since Rebecca had made it quietly clear at some point over the summer that she found this convention both condescending and irrelevant. He courted her in the way that suited them both, which was honestly and directly and in the ordinary course of a life that was becoming, gradually and then all at once, shared. He came to supper at her house one Thursday in September, the first time he had been inside it, and found it exactly what he might have expected and also entirely unique. The neatness of a person who lives alone and has made peace with it, the bookshelves filled to capacity, the kitchen a place of obvious serious use, a small detail on the windowsill of a rock she had picked up somewhere and kept because she liked its shape. He looked at that rock and understood without being told an enormous amount about who she was. She had made a good meal, beans and cornbread, and a piece of beef she had gotten from the butcher, and a pie afterward, apple, from the 2 trees she kept in her garden. And they ate at the table in the small dining room with the evening air coming through the open window, and the sound of the town's evening quieting down around them. They talked as they always talked, easily, following whatever the conversation wanted to follow, and at some point the talking gave way to a comfortable quiet that had no need of filling. She was washing up and he had taken a towel and was drying the dishes without being asked, standing at her kitchen counter, and she looked at him sideways and felt the kind of happiness that is so quiet and specific that you almost miss it, the happiness of things being right. "Perry," she said. He looked at her. "I would like you to know," she said, carefully and with great precision, "that I am not generally given to, I mean to say," she stopped, which was unusual for her, and seemed to recognize it as unusual, and a slightly exasperated look crossed her face that he found completely charming. "I am trying to tell you something and I am making a poor job of it." "Take your time," he said. She looked at him directly in the way she looked at everything, straight on, fully present. "I have been careful this summer," she said, "very deliberately careful, about what I allowed myself to feel and what I allowed myself to expect, because I have been in the position before of allowing myself to feel more than the situation warranted, and it was," she searched for the word, "costly." "I know," he said quietly. "I want you to know that the care I have been taking was not about you," she said. "It was about me, about where I was, and I want you to know that it is different now, what I feel." She was looking at him steadily, her hand still wet, the towel in his hand still. "I care about you considerably, Perry Conroy, in a way that is not careful anymore and has not been for some time, if I am being honest with myself." He set the towel on the counter. He stepped the 2 steps that were between them and took both her hands in his, the water and all, and held them. "Rebecca Bristol," he said, and his voice was low and certain, "I have been waiting to hear something like that since approximately the second time I walked through the door of your telegraph office, and I have been practicing patience because I understood it was required, and because you are worth whatever patience is required." He held her hands a little tighter. "I came to Dustcreek to buy land and build a life. I had not anticipated that the life would have a person in it this quickly. I had not, to be honest, allowed myself to plan for that. But there you were, absolutely present and entirely yourself, and he stopped, reconsidered. "I am saying the same thing you were saying. I am just taking longer to get there." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth turned up and became, this time, a full, genuine smile, open and real, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a long time. "Then we are both saying the same thing," she said. "We are," he said. He leaned in and kissed her, gently, unhurried, his hand still holding hers, and she kissed him back with the warmth of someone who had been waiting without knowing how completely she had been waiting. And the evening air came through the window, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and it was entirely, completely right. The proposal was not dramatic, which suited them both. It was October, the weather finally breaking into the bliss of a Texas autumn, the air clear and cool and smelling of dry grass and the mesquite along the creek. They had ridden out to the Bristol parcel together. It was already becoming something they did regularly on Saturday mornings. The ride out to the land, walking the boundary, checking on the cattle he had brought in September, sitting sometimes by the creek in the morning light. They were sitting on the porch of the stone house, which was now entirely habitable, clean and repaired, a new rug he had bought in town on the floor, a proper iron stove in the kitchen corner, the fireplace clean and ready. The morning was cool and gold, and the land spread away from them in every direction, brown and wide and beautiful in the way that plain places are beautiful if you learn to look at them right. "I want to ask you to marry me," Perry said. He said it straightforwardly, without ceremony, looking at the land rather than at her. "I have been thinking about how to do it for 3 weeks, and everything I considered seemed either too theatrical or too casual. And in the end, I think the truth is that I would simply like to ask you plainly and let you answer plainly." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said you would consider yourself lucky to have arrived late." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the land, a slight expression he had come to recognize, the one she wore when she was turning something over carefully. "Excuse me," he said. She turned to look at him. "You said it last week, when Mavis made that remark at the church steps. You were standing behind me, and I do not think you realized I could hear you. Mavis was telling Mrs. Henshaw that it was a pity about us, that a woman of my age and a man like you deserved better prospects or some such thing. And you said to yourself, quietly, that you considered yourself lucky to have arrived when you did." She held his gaze. "I have been carrying that around for a week." He looked at her, something moving in his face. "Every man in this town," she said, "has spent 6 years looking at me and seeing what I am not young enough, not quiet enough, not properly marriageable. And you—" She stopped. Her voice, for the first time in all the months he had known her, had the slightest unsteadiness in it. "You looked at the same woman and saw something worth being lucky about." "Rebecca," he said. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, and now the full smile was there, full and clear and real. "You asked me to marry you. The answer is yes." He laughed, which happened rarely enough that she had catalogued every instance of it, and reached over and took her hand. And they sat on the porch of the stone house on his land, on the Bristol parcel, the land that had her name in it, the land that had been her uncle's and was now his and would soon be theirs, and watched the October morning move across the flat Texas country, and were, in the quiet and simple and absolutely complete way of two people who have found exactly the right thing, happy. They were married on a Saturday in November of 1878 at the small white church in Dustcreek that had been struck by lightning twice and rebuilt twice and was still standing, which Rebecca privately considered an appropriate venue for a marriage between two people who had also been struck by various difficulties and rebuilt. The church was full. Every person in Dustcreek came, which is what happens in a small town when two people are well liked, and the story is a good one. Even Mavis Turnbull came, wearing her best hat, and had the grace to say afterward, in the hearing of several people, that she had been wrong about Rebecca's prospects, which was the closest to an apology that Mavis Turnbull was constitutionally capable of producing, and was received in the spirit it was intended. Doc Hargrove stood up with Perry, which was his honor, and Dorothea Ingle stood up with Rebecca, and Walt and Hector Fuentes sat in the front pew and grinned throughout, and Mrs. Garcia from the Silver Fork provided the wedding supper, which featured her chicken and rice, and Perry quietly told Rebecca that he considered this deeply appropriate, and she replied that she had specifically asked for it. The preacher, a young man named Holloway who had come to Dustcreek the previous spring and was still learning how to read his congregation, asked if they had anything to say to each other, which was not the usual form of the ceremony, but he had gathered, from the general atmosphere of the town regarding these two particular people, that something beyond the standard vows was called for. Perry turned to Rebecca. He had thought about this, as he thought about most things carefully and without pretension. "I was 35 years old when I came to Dustcreek," he said. "I had done enough living to know that the thing I was looking for was not something that could be planned for, and I had made my peace with possibly not finding it. And then I walked into a telegraph office, and you looked at me directly, and I understood, in a way I can't entirely explain, that here was a person I needed to know." He held her hands. "I do not think I arrived late. I think I arrived exactly when I was supposed to. And every day between now and whatever day is the last one, I intend to be worthy of the luck of finding you." Rebecca, who had prepared nothing and who was not, as a rule, a woman given to public declarations, found that words were happening regardless. "I had decided," she said, "that the town was probably right about me. Not that I had accepted it easily, but that fighting it was exhausting and the evidence seemed to support it. And then you walked in and asked for nothing except my actual company and my actual thoughts, and treated both as if they had value," which she stopped. "The church was very quiet, which they do, I know that. I have always known that. But there is a difference between knowing a thing about yourself and having it reflected back to you by someone whose opinion you deeply respect." She held his gaze, and her eyes were bright, though her voice was steady. "You saw me, Perry, entirely, and I intend to spend the rest of my life seeing you the same way." There was, in the small white church in Dustcreek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878, a silence that had a texture to it. The texture of people who have witnessed something genuine and are briefly too moved to fill it with ordinary noise. Then someone, Walt Fuentes probably, started clapping, and the rest of the church followed, and the preacher cleared his throat happily and declared them married, and Perry kissed his wife with the simple, thorough sincerity of a man who means everything he does. And Dustcreek, Texas, which had been so certain it knew the end of Rebecca Bristol's story, discovered that it had been wrong in the most wonderful way possible. They made their home on the Bristol parcel together, which was what both of them had wanted from the moment it became a possibility, though neither had said so directly until after the wedding, when they were riding back to the property in the November evening, and Perry said that he hoped she would find it home enough, and she told him she had known since August that it was where she wanted to be. She kept the telegraph office for the first year of their marriage. Dustcreek needed it, and she was good at it, and there was no particular reason, she reasoned, to stop being good at things simply because her circumstances had changed. Perry agreed with this without reservation, which continued to be one of his most endearing qualities. She trained a young man named Thomas Pickett, who had good hands and a sharp ear, to handle the key on the days she could not come in, and gradually, over the course of the year, transition the primary operation to him while retaining oversight and handling the complicated transmissions herself. By the second spring, she was only going into town twice a week, which suited the rhythm of the property, which had needs that kept both of them fully occupied. The cattle operation was building steadily. Perry was a methodical, careful rancher, not flashy but consistent, the kind of operation that does not have spectacular years, but also does not have catastrophic ones. He brought in a small initial herd in the fall of 1878 and expanded carefully each year after, always within what the land and the water could support, always with attention to the drought conditions that were the persistent concern of West Texas ranching. The stone house was becoming a home in the specific, layered way that happens when two people who are both invested in where they live put their attention to it over time. Rebecca's books filled the shelves of the main room alongside the maps and ledgers of the cattle operation. The kitchen became the territory of both of them. She cooked with the practical efficiency of someone who had been cooking for one for years and found cooking for two a genuine pleasure, and he proved unexpectedly capable in the kitchen, having fed himself and his crew in New Mexico by necessity and developed actual skill. They ate well, which is not a small thing in a life. The garden expanded. She got the deer situation partially under control with a better fence, which Perry built in June of their first year to her precise specifications, including the gate she wanted in the northeast corner for easy access. And the deer got in anyway the following August from the southwest corner, and she stood in the ruined corn patch and said something that he chose to pretend he had not heard, and they both laughed until the corn patch was genuinely funny. In the spring of 1880, their son was born. Rebecca was 34 years old, which was not, in 1880, a particularly safe age for a first birth, and Doc Hargrove made this journey from Dustcreek and handled the birth with the competent attention that had made him the town's indispensable medical resource for 20 years. It was a difficult labor, long, not dangerous in the end, but long enough that Perry spent 8 hours on the porch of the stone house, discovering the precise limits of his ability to maintain composure, which turned out to be lower than he had previously believed. When Doc Hargrove came out on the porch and said it was done, and they were both fine, Perry sat down on the porch steps with the specific, heavy relief of a man whose emotional reserves have been completely exhausted, and Doc said nothing but sat beside him for a moment, which was what the moment required. Their son was large and red-faced, and had from his first hour a quality of absolute determination about him that was entirely familiar to both his parents. They named him Thomas, for her uncle and for the land, and this choice was made between them in about 30 seconds of conversation the week before he was born, because they both thought of it at the same time. Thomas Bristol Conroy entered the world in the stone house on the flat land of West Texas at approximately 4 in the morning on a May day in 1880, and Rebecca held him in the bedroom with the limestone walls and looked at Perry, who was looking at both of them with an expression that had no adequate name, and she thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago. Sitting at the counter of the telegraph office with her hat pinned on and her books sent from San Antonio and her excellent tomatoes and her practiced self-sufficiency, and thought about the distance between that woman and this one, here in this room, with this man and this child, and found that the distance was enormous and necessary and not, she understood with clarity, a loss of the woman she had been but a continuation of her, enriched and changed and fundamentally still herself. "Hello, Thomas," she said to her son. He stopped crying immediately and looked at her with the unfocused, profound attention of the newly arrived. "He has your eyes," Perry said, his voice entirely different from its usual quality, lower, softer, changed. "He has your chin," she said, "which I consider fair warning." Perry laughed softly, and came and sat on the bed beside her and put his arm around her and looked at the boy they had made and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The years that followed were full in the way that the lives of people who work hard and love well tend to be full, not with grand events, but with the accumulating substance of ordinary days that are, each one worth having. Doc Hargrove retired in 1881 and moved to San Antonio to live with his daughter, and Rebecca and Perry saw him off at the stage with genuine feeling, and a hamper of provisions that she had packed and he had tried to refuse, and she had placed firmly in his hands regardless. He wrote to them regularly, cheerful letters full of observations about city life that he found baffling and occasionally infuriating. Thomas Pickett became the full-time telegraph operator, having learned the work from Rebecca with the serious application of someone who understands what they have been given. He did her credit, and she was proud of him, and told him so in the plain way she told people things, which was one of the things that made being told something by Rebecca Conroy mean a great deal. Dustcreek grew through the early 1880s, the expansion of the cattle trade bringing more families to the area, a school with 2 rooms now instead of 1, a second church, a doctor from Ohio named Marshall who was young and earnest, and replaced Doc Hargrove's irreplaceable pragmatism with a slightly different but equally useful pragmatism of his own. The telegraph line was expanded, additional stops added down the line, and Dustcreek became a hub rather than a terminus, which meant that Thomas Pickett's office was considerably busier and Rebecca was occasionally called on for consulting when something complicated came through, which she handled from the property. In 1882, their daughter was born, a girl they named Louisa, after Perry's mother, a woman he had loved and lost to a fever when he was 19, and who he had not talked about often but clearly carried with him. Louisa came into the world considerably faster than Thomas had, which was a relief to everyone involved, and she was from the beginning a smaller, fiercer version of her mother, quieter than Thomas, who had become a boisterous, outdoors-committed boy, but possessed of the same quality of direct attention that Rebecca had always had, the same habit of looking at things straight. The Bristol parcel flourished. Perry's methodical approach to the cattle operation had, by 1883, produced an operation that was comfortably profitable without being so large that it couldn't be managed with integrity. He had a small crew of 4 men now, including the Fuentes brothers, who had stayed on from the beginning and had become something closer to partners than employees, and the operation ran with the smooth efficiency of something built on honest ground. On a Saturday evening in the fall of 1883, the 5-year anniversary of their wedding, they sat on the porch of the stone house in the cooling air of a Texas October, Thomas asleep inside after exhausting himself with some manner of effort involving the creek and a great deal of mud that had required significant intervention, Louisa still awake and sitting on the porch floor between them, occupied with some arrangement of small stones that seemed to require intense concentration. The sky was doing its thing, the enormous, extravagant thing that West Texas skies do in October evenings, the colors impossible and real simultaneously, the flat land going dark at the edges and luminous in the middle where the last light gathered. Perry had his hand over Rebecca's on the arm of her chair, as he often did in the evenings, a gesture so natural that it was no longer a gesture so much as a position, the default arrangement of 2 people whose hands had found each other and found it right. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he agreed. She looked at the sky. I keep thinking about what I believed 5 years ago, she said, about what I thought the options were. What I thought I was looking at for the next 30 years. And what was that, he asked, though he knew more or less. The telegraph office and the garden and the books and the town's settled opinion of me, she said. Not with bitterness still, she had never arrived at bitterness, which was one of the things about her he found most extraordinary, just as a fact. It was not a bad life. I want to be clear about that. I was not miserable. I know you were not, he said, but it was, she paused. Smaller than this. He looked at her, this woman who was his wife and the mother of his children and his best companion and the person whose opinion he valued more than anyone else's on earth, and felt the particular, quiet, overwhelming gratitude of someone who knows with certainty that the best thing in their life was not something they managed or engineered, but something they were simply, profoundly lucky enough to encounter. I told you, he said. I considered myself lucky to have arrived when I did. She turned and looked at him, and the smile that crossed her face was the real one, the full one, the one that had been there in the telegraph office when she first let it out, and had been a constant fixture ever since. You did say that, she said, and you were right. Louisa, on the floor between them, looked up from her stone arrangement at her parents in the way that small children look at their parents when the adults are having a feeling that the child can sense but not name, with a focused, serious attention. Mama, she said, yes, love, are the stones right? Rebecca looked at the arrangement on the porch floor, a series of small flat stones set in a pattern that had its own logic. "The stones are perfectly right," she said, and Louisa returned to them with satisfaction. Perry's hand tightened slightly over hers. The evening settled around them, the sky going from orange to deep rose to the first deep blue of coming dark. The cattle sounds from the pasture drifting in the still air, the light from the windows of the house warm at their backs, the smell of the land and the evening, and the particular, irreplaceable smell of a home that has been lived in with love. There is a version of a life that is manageable and adequate and not unhappy, and there is a version that is full, not without difficulty, not without the accumulated weight of what has been lost along the way, but full in the genuine sense, in the sense of being actually inhabited by actual people who are actually present to each other. Rebecca Bristol had lived the first version for long enough to know its contours intimately, and she lived the second version now with the full appreciation of someone who knows the difference. The town of Dustcreek had been very sure, for a long time, that it knew what her life was going to look like. It had categorized her, filed her away, settled into the comfortable certainty of a community that has decided about someone. It had been wrong. Not maliciously, mostly not maliciously, but wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they measure a person against their expectations, rather than against the person's actual dimensions. Perry Conroy had arrived in Dustcreek with no expectations about Rebecca Bristol because he had not known she existed, and what he had found when he walked through the door of her office was simply a person direct, capable, real, possessed of brown eyes that looked at things straight, and a quality of presence that he had recognized from the first moment as something he did not want to be without. He had not arrived too late. He had not arrived early. He had arrived when he arrived, in the ordinary way that things happen, without design, without drama, simply the convergence of a man going one direction and a woman standing in the one place where their paths were going to cross, and the ordinary miracle of two people finding that the world is better when it contains each other. In the years that followed, the stone house on the Bristol parcel was the kind of home that people felt the warmth of when they came near it, not because it was grand or prosperous, though it was comfortable and well-maintained, but because of the quality of what went on inside it. The conversations that happened at that kitchen table. The arguments that were had and resolved with the thoroughness of two people who believe the other person is worth the effort of resolution. The evenings on the porch and the mornings by the creek and the particular sound of the house when everyone in it was asleep, and the only sound was the wind off the flat land, and the stars were enormous and close in the enormous Texas sky. Thomas grew into a boy and then a young man with his mother's directness and his father's patience, and by the time he was 12, he could manage a significant portion of the cattle work himself, not because anyone pushed him toward it, but because he loved the land with the specific, rooted love of someone who has grown up with it under their feet. Louisa grew up with the same love but a different expression of it. She wanted to know things, everything, and Rebecca, sent away to San Antonio and later to a new bookseller in Fort Worth for whatever could be found. And Louisa read with the intensity of someone who finds the world in every page and wants to consume it entirely. She had her mother's habit of looking directly at whatever she was addressing and her father's habit of proceeding thoughtfully, and the combination of these things suggested, as both her parents noted privately to each other, that she was going to be formidable. In the spring of 1885, a third child arrived, another son, born in March, smaller than Thomas had been but equally determined about the business of being alive. They named him James, after no one in particular, simply because they had both always liked the name, and James proved to be a child of enormous good humor who laughed at things from a remarkably early age, and maintained this quality as he grew, filling the stone house with a quality of levity that balanced his older siblings' more serious natures beautifully. with 3 children in the house and the cattle operation at a size that required Perry's full attention for most of the working week, and Rebecca's continuing management of the property's books and correspondence, and her ongoing occasional consulting role with the telegraph office, and the garden which she refused to reduce regardless of what else was happening. Their days were full in the way that is not romantic to describe, but is the actual substance of a life worth living, demanding and ordinary, and interrupted constantly and fundamentally, completely satisfying. There were difficulties. There were always difficulties in West Texas in the 1880s drought years that required careful management and careful economies. A winter in 1886 that killed more cattle than any of the ranchers in the area wished to think about. A dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line that required legal mediation and temporarily soured relationships with people they had previously considered friends. Perry got sick in the winter of 1884 with a chest illness that kept him in bed for 3 weeks and frightened Rebecca in ways she did not fully articulate, but that emerged in the quality of her attention to him through those weeks, close, watchful, fierce, with the specific fierceness of someone who has found what they love and is not willing to give it up to chance. He recovered fully, which was what Doc Marshall assured her would happen from early on, and which she chose to believe while also continuing to watch. When he was well and back to himself, she said to him one evening, with the plainness that she brought to everything, "I do not like being frightened for you." "I know," he said. "I am sorry. You did not choose to be ill," she said. "I am not assigning blame. I am only," she looked at him, "I am telling you that you are very important to me, and that the idea of losing you is not one I find I can approach with equanimity." He had taken her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, this woman who managed everything with competence and calm, and who was, in this particular admission, letting him see something that the practical surface of her usually covered. "I am here," he said. "I am entirely here." "Good," she said. "Stay that way." He had kissed her, and she had let herself be kissed with the same completeness that she brought to everything, and they had stayed that way for a long while in the quiet house with the children asleep and the winter wind outside and the fireplace drawing well, as it always did in the stone house, just as she had told him it would in the very beginning. By the end of the 1880s, Dustcreek had settled into a different relationship with Rebecca Conroy than it had previously had with Rebecca Bristol. The Mavis Turnbull school of opinion had not entirely surrendered. Mavis herself remained on the scene until her own death in 1891 and continued to have views about things, though she was observed in her last years to be somewhat softer toward Rebecca than she had been in earlier days, possibly because age had revised some of her certainties. But the broader town had come around to something closer to the truth, which was that Rebecca Conroy was one of the town's most significant assets, someone whose work and intelligence and practical engagement had served the community in ways that were finally being acknowledged rather than ignored. The women of the quilting circles had, somewhat late in the day, resumed inviting her, and she went occasionally, finding that she had more patience for it now than she once had, partly because her own contentment made other people's opinions a less pressing matter. She remained, and would always remain, herself direct, a little dry, possessed of the kind of laugh that you had to earn and the kind of attention that once given was entirely genuine. She had not become someone else by marrying or by having children or by building a life that looked, from the outside, more like what Dustcreek had always expected of its women. She had simply become more fully herself, which is the best thing that happiness can do to a person. Perry Conroy, for his part, was known in Dustcreek as a fair and capable man, a good rancher, a man whose word was reliable, someone you could trust in a trade and trust in a conversation. He was not an outgoing man. He did not hold court at the Red Kettle or dominate the proceedings at town meetings. But people who knew him understood that he was present, paying attention, thoughtful, and that when he said something it was worth hearing. He was also known, by those who observed closely, as a man who looked at his wife the way that men look at the thing they value most, with a quality of attention that is not possessive, but is profound, the steady, voluntary direction of all of your regard toward another person because they are the person who makes sense of everything else. He had said he considered himself lucky to arrive when he did. He had meant it when he said it, and he meant it every day that followed. Not in the passive sense of luck as something that happens to you, but in the active sense of recognizing the value of what you have found and choosing, every morning, to be worthy of it. On a Saturday morning in the autumn of 1888, 10 years after his stage had rolled into Dustcreek and deposited him on the main street with his hat and his gear and his plans, Perry Conroy stood on the porch of the stone house on the Bristol parcel and watched the October morning moving over his land. Thomas was already down at the barn, doing what Thomas always did at first light. Louisa was inside at the kitchen table with a book, and if he knew her, a cold cup of coffee she had made and forgotten to drink. James was still asleep, which was James's consistent position on any morning that did not have an absolute deadline attached to it. Rebecca came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee, hot, and handed him one and stood beside him, and for a moment they just looked at it, the land, the morning, the particular October gold of the Texas grass going all the way to the horizon. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he confirmed. Do you ever think about the version where you do not come to Dustcreek? She asked. It was not a melancholy question. It was the kind of question you ask when you are in a good place and curious about the architecture of it. Sometimes, he said. Mostly I think it was going to be Dustcreek or somewhere else, and the somewhere else would have been a decent life, but it would not have been this. He looked at her. There is no version of this without you. She held his gaze and smiled, the real one, the full one, the one that had been there from the beginning and that still, after 10 years, landed in his chest with the same specific, irreplaceable weight. No, she agreed. There is not. Louisa appeared in the doorway, book in one hand, cold coffee in the other, looking at her parents with the expression of a child who has observed her parents being like this for her entire conscious life, and finds it both slightly embarrassing and privately wonderful. Are you two being sentimental again? She asked. Extremely, Perry confirmed. Thomas says the east fence needs attention, Louisa reported. Thomas is right, Perry said. I will be down in a minute. Louisa retreated with her book and her cold coffee. Perry and Rebecca stayed on the porch a minute longer, the land spread wide around them, the morning opening ahead of them, everything that they had built together real and solid and entirely theirs. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him take it, and they stood like that in the October morning on the Bristol parcel that was the Conroy Ranch, in Dustcreek, Texas, in the fall of 1888, with everything resolved and everything right and the whole long good future of it still ahead of them. The town had been wrong about Rebecca Bristol. She had known it and had chosen, mostly, to rise above the knowing rather than be diminished by it. Perry Conroy had known it from the first day without needing to be told. And the land they stood on, the land that had her name in it, held them both the way good land holds the people who love it, solid, unhurried, permanent. It was enough. It was, in every meaningful way, far more than enough. It was everything.